Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistani in what will probably be the last episode of the year because I will be on vacation starting soon. And I figured there would be no better guest than having Khurram Husain back on the podcast, this time to talk about a bit about what happened in 24 from his perspective on the economic front, but more importantly, what he anticipates in 2025. So, Khurram, welcome back to Pakistani, and I hope you're gearing up for the holiday season.
I certainly am, and we're in the middle of a cold wave and loving it.
Well, I am excited to experience that as well. It's really cold here. It's like below freezing in Washington, D.C. So I'll see you hopefully in Karachi in a few days' time. Let's begin with 2024, and then we'll jump into what you anticipate for next year. I was looking back at my notes ahead of this conversation. I look at January, February, obviously was the election month. But in first quarter, there was still this lingering question about Pakistan's economic stability. Yes, there was a standby arrangement, but everybody knew that was just a leftover sort of holding pattern event, and there would have to be a bigger program. And related to that, there was this question about whether Pakistan would default, right? You and I recall having many conversations about what was being written, said, etc., about debt restructuring, etc. How do you sort of look back at the year 2024? Now that we're in December, inflation has come down, the stock market is reaching new highs, and reserves or the current account surplus in particular has been quite stable.
Well, there are a couple of questions in there. Uzair, let me start with this, that when I look back at the year 2024, I see this as the year the economy stabilized. Finally, it found its moorings and its footing, at least in terms of the macroeconomic indicators, right? Even if there is no sort of dynamism or growth taking place underneath. But look at the cost at which this stability came. And, you know, without mincing words, in essence, it was necessary to hoist an illegitimate government onto the country in order to be able to undertake the kind of stabilization measures that were required and finally pull the ship of state away from the specter of default in a convincing way. The state had been haunted by the specter of default since at least 2021. Well, definitely from 2021 onwards. But and you and I got together on a number of occasions over those years between then and now to talk about how close things came and how we kept pulling back and then coming back to the edge, then pulling back and then coming back to the edge. 24 was the year in which that pattern finally broke. Of course, it can, prove to be a short-lived spell of stability, and perhaps something can happen in the year 2025 that will restart the pattern of moving away from stability back towards default again. But for now, it's looking unlikely. But that's what it took. It took having to basically for the military to step in, by and large, put an end to the political, put an end to politics basically in this country and hold an election that even its own winners are not really buying. Even the people who won this election, do express incredulity at the fact that the results were what they were, or at least the results showed what they did. Um, we can say that the country is under all but martial law by now. This is an undeclared state of martial law. The politics has been put in a tiny little box somewhere. All decision making has been centralized in the hands of the military, and and there we are. And then, yes, an IMF program was signed and began to be, well, it was signed in 2023 with the arrival of the interim government, but now we've got the long-term program signed. The reserves have finally risen to provide about 2.5 months of import cover. That's up from about less than 1 month of import cover in the heydays of the default, the summers of 22 and 23, which is emergency levels. And 3 months, as we both know, is considered comfortable by international benchmarks. If you have 3 months of import cover, you're considered fine, by most standards internationally. So right now, Pakistan's at 2.5 months and rising. They'll probably hit 3 months before the end of the fiscal year, at which point they can say that, okay, stability has been restored. But in any case, 24 was the year in which stability was restored. 24 was the year in which an illegitimate government was hoisted onto this, and I keep repeating this, hoisted onto the country in order to take decision making out of the hands of the contestants in the political arena. And 24 will probably also, I think, in hindsight, be the year in which finally Imran Khan's really powerful and ferocious bid to return to power that he launched in March of 2022 was broken, where the tide of where the tsunami that Khan had promised was finally delivered. I think, in my opinion, he delivered it. The last November 26th march that was undertaken. Um, and But it broke, and the state managed to finally absorb the full brunt of that and repelled the protesters who had stormed the capital. And I think from here onwards, the PTI is now entering into an internal crisis, or at least appears to be, about what future direction they should take. But the violent style of politics seems to have run its course. All of these things happened in the year 2024, and what a cost the country paid for the political storms that broke out following the vote of no confidence in March 2022, which twice carried the country to the very edge of catastrophe before finally pulling back. Now we'll wait to see how much of this continues into the year 2025.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned and used the term illegitimate government, because I often get comments either in the YouTube section and or directly of people saying, well, you don't talk about this government as much as you used to talk about the last government and its legitimacy. And I always remind them that, I never had a guest during the PTI era like Zahid Hussain who said this is martial law with a civilian facade. And you said the same
Yeah,
thing pretty much today.
yeah.
And so I think people just have short memories or don't watch content beyond 60 seconds and they want that viral clip. But yeah, I fully agree with you. And you talked about the 26th November protest and sort of the regime breaking the back of Imran Khan's tsunami. That also, we should mention, came at the cost of lives. Five at
Yes.
least confirmed by the government, 12 or so, or 18. The number, I think, it is irrelevant in the sense that when the state and its machinery opens fire on its own
Yes.
citizens and even one citizen dies, that is a tragedy in and of itself, and shows the extent at which the state is willing to go to break politics or break the politics of the opposition leader, in this case, Imran Khan Sahab. Um, I want to ask one more thing about 24, which is, I was talking to a journalist friend of mine who was like, haven't seen you on TV in the last few weeks. And I'm like, well, if you don't see people like Khurram and myself on TV on 8 p.m., it's probably a good thing because the economy is back, in the back of people's minds, and it's not front and center. And when it's front and center, it's usually a crisis. But was this also the year of the emergence of a new, I would say, Hafiz Sheikh 2.0, Mr. Aurangzeb, Finance Minister Aurangzeb? And I know, and it took a lot of intervention from Pindi to ensure that he and not somebody like, I'll say, Mr. Dar entered the finance ministry or the Q block once again. Do you think in Pakistan's non-political facade of a martial law regime, he's sort of the man of the year in terms of delivering at least what was expected of him in 24?
Um, I wouldn't go that far just yet. I think he has delivered some things. He's failed to deliver some others. Let's look at it this way. I think, in my view at least, the economic stabilization began in July 2023. And we had our last conversation in August of 2023, in which by which time it wasn't clear whether or not that stabilization will succeed. Things were pretty bad, as we both remember, in July 23. Um, but by January or February of 2024, the stability had begun. The marks of the real sort of important markers of stability had begun to return. The primary surplus, for example, was posted in the July to December period. and a
I think
larger one
money
than what
supply growth had also significantly
money
eased.
supply growth tapered off very significantly. So I think a lot of the work was done in that period. And that was also a period when politics was in suspension because it was an interim government. And interim governments historically have been used to undertake these kind of adjustments in
An
Pakistan.
interim government, let's also say that was ruling beyond its constitutional mandate of what is
Yes.
expected in between elections.
Yes, in a sense, the illegitimacy of it all had begun already, right, back then. Um, it, but without sort of going down that slippery slope yet, we can do it later. But for now, if we just trace the origins of the stability, it pretty much returns when politics ends, and that's from when the government, the parliament that came into being in 2018 finally ends its term. And that is in July 2023, exactly 5 years later. When that parliament ends, then stability begins to return. And I think this is probably the stormiest parliament that we've ever had in our history. I don't recall any parliament session, a single parliament which completed its term and yet had, a change of government in between and then an embattled mandate afterwards. Had to violate Supreme Court orders to hold elections within 90 days. All that. I mean, we saw all that happen. When that ended and the interim government entered the scene, you could say that, in a sense, politics was now held in abeyance, in a constitutional sense, right? And the interim government is the one that began undertaking the steps, husbanding the reserves, rebuilding the fiscal buffers, posting the first primary surplus after a very long time, and restraining the current account deficit. Um, and what our new finance minister, Aurangzeb, that you're referring to as Hafiz Sheikh too, did was inherit all of this stabilization that had already happened and started to carry it forward. Now, in my view, I wouldn't go so far as to call him Hafiz Sheikh too. Um, there are some similarities, perhaps, in the sense that he is exclusively focused on the economy and he's not allowing himself to be distracted by any of the other, political noise that he's surrounded by. But Hafiz Sheikh was very famous for keeping all MNAs and MPAs, etc., all elected officials outside of his door. He would not open his door to them. And keeping the development budget severely under very, very tight constraints. I don't think Aurangzeb is going down that road. He's opting to actually engage with elected officials to the extent that he can, given his fiscal space. He's much more willing to engage with the wider apparatus of democracy around him, such as it is, parliamentary
Yeah, I
committees and
almost
whatnot.
chuckled when you say wider apparatus of democracy.
But I mean, appearing before parliamentary committees, appearing before Senate committees, for example, that's something Hafiz Sheikh used to really chafe at. But Aurangzeb is more willing to not just entertain requests from MNAs, grant them an audience in his own office, but also to engage with parliamentary and Senate committees. So there's a bit more of an engagement on his part. So that sets him apart. It's not quite as cold-blooded and ruthless a way of operating as Hafiz Sheikh was. He's got a much softer way of doing things. I think one result of that, perhaps, is that there's not a lot of outcomes to show for his 9 or 10 months in power, other than the fact that he's managed to carry forward the economic stabilization so far. But I think he's going to have a hard time. I mean, they're trying to sell state assets to bring in dollars in this country, whether PIA or whether Recodic, the ex-Pakistan government's share of Recodic, and they're not really able to do that. They've got the really hard-boiled structural reforms to undertake in the power sector side that has been committed with the IMF. These kind of steps are going to become very difficult to do, and also to meet revenue targets without placing additional burdens on those that are already within the tax net. So salaried people have been crushed virtually by Aurangzeb's budget. and his inability to actually rope in people from outside the tax net, his inability to even try. I mean, I don't really see much of an effort to broaden the tax base, to undertake any kind of structural reforms. So I think his challenges are going to begin to mount in the year to come, because you can't keep the progress or the timeline on structural reforms stagnant while undertaking macroeconomic adjustment for very long. Eventually, that starts to create pressures that sort of come up in the form of political demands to pump growth, to bring in liquidity from abroad, to borrow, to float bonds and borrow money, whether if that's what it takes, to bring down the dollar, slash interest rates more precipitously than perhaps the fundamentals might merit at the moment. All kinds of steps such as these. And I do think that in 2025, it's entirely possible that these pressures are going to start to mount.
Well, one of the things you mentioned brought this thought in my mind as well about 24, which is that the finance minister's job also in the Pakistani context is to reassure investors, both domestic and foreign, right? Because that is the way where how he or she can create space for themselves politically, but also tell a story about growth and investment and job creation in the economy. And I wanted to get your perspective on what implications 2024 has for the investors in Pakistan, both domestic and foreign. And specifically, I refer to the way in which the IPPs were negotiated with, and sort of, underappreciated story. But I think in business circles, or, the economic circles that you and I talk to quite frequently, it was a major event in the way in which these contracts were negotiated. How significant do you think that particular event will be moving forward for Pakistan in terms of investor confidence and the ability to marshal new investment into the economy in 25?
Well, we're picking up some contradictory signals on as far as investor confidence is concerned, Uzair. So, for example, the OICCI, that's the Overseas Investors Chamber of Commerce and Industry, does an annual exercise to measure investor sentiment, investor confidence in particular. And by and large, their survey, they've been doing it for many years, and people do rely on it to as one gauge of investor confidence, and they're showing an uptick in recent months. That uptick basically comes from the stability, the fact that the wild exchange rate movements have finally stopped. That completely throws off.
So overseas investors, primarily who are American, are in on the American conspiracy. I'm just winking along the way on this as well. That's the takeaway there.
Well, yeah, maybe there's a conspiracy to it, but I mean the stabilization that has happened does, and this is historical. Every time the economy stabilizes under the auspices of an IMF program, it boosts investor confidence. We see that happen every single time. And it's not difficult to see why. The exchange rate has finally bottomed out. Investors can see that. The interest rates have finally peaked. Investors can see that. Asset prices are now beginning to adjust, much like consumer prices adjusted in preceding years. Investors can see that, and one of the places where that is registering itself, the asset price adjustment taking place, is the stock exchange, where share prices are adjusting accordingly. So these things are real, and they are happening, and they do point to the return of some amount of investor confidence. But the process has taken a big hit in the form of the forced renegotiation of IPP contracts. How that renegotiation was carried out, it was very roughshod, and also, I mean, the fact that it was carried out, the manner in which it was carried out, and I think investors saw how easy it was in Pakistan to build a campaign vilifying one large category of investor, vilifying the independent power policies and the independent power producers, and their the terms on which they make their returns. and turning that into some kind of, the central or the core problem that ails Pakistan's economy, that if only we can overthrow this, everything will be fine. The kind of outlandish claims that were made as that campaign wore on. You're familiar with that because you were on the air, as was I, while that campaign was underway. And you recall how the TV anchors were asking us, people like you, me, and others, our peers, in the economic conversation in this country. What they were asking us, what's going on? Why are these IPPs making money even when they don't sell electricity to the state? They weren't able to quite understand why there should be capacity charges in a project like that, etc., etc. But if you are an investor looking to acquire long-term stakes in Pakistan, you will seek to want to protect yourself from the breakout of the kinds of economic storms that break out in this country every time it veers into a balance of payments crisis. Sharp rises in interest rates, sharp depreciations in the value of the national currency. If your earnings are denominated in rupees, but your liabilities are denominated in dollars, or at least some of the liabilities are denominated in dollars, you are a major stakeholder in the exchange rate. And you're going to look back and say, okay, wait a minute, with so much exchange rate volatility over the past 20 years, what do the next 20 years look like? And you will seek to protect yourself from that. And likewise with these periodic renegotiations, when everybody just wants to come in and anytime 5 years down the road, and they'll want to say that, hey, let's renegotiate these prices. In the power sector, there was one party that had literally just purchased a power plant in, I think, October. It was in Uch. And or September that they had purchased it, and in October they were asked to renegotiate the tariff. So everybody was watching that, and I think in future, whatever investors do come, they will seek to protect themselves from these kinds of storms.
So I think that's an important point, right, Khurram, about investors and investor confidence. And on the media front, I remember having this conversation with the journalist and having to explain to them, hey, if you are injured badly, God forbid, and you're in bed, but you have a car lease payment, you still got to pay the car lease payment, right? And that has to be done regardless of the fact that you use the car or not. And to your point on investors seeking more assurances, absolutely, there is a reason why there's a risk premium on Pakistan when investors make a choice about deploying long-term capital in the country in particular. And that risk premium will get reflected in future contracts. And I think anybody who in Islamabad or Rawalpindi thinks that that's not going to happen is sorely mistaken, because that's just how finance works. Moving on into 2025, in terms of what you anticipate and some events you're keeping an eye out, I want to set the scene in terms of the macro global environment that I am seeing, and then would love your thoughts on the domestic front in Pakistan and its implications. Is that we look at OPEC Plus. They keep cutting production or delaying the increased production that was planned because of this softness in international demand, which I see as a good thing for Pakistan. High energy prices always lead to one way or the other a macroeconomic crisis in the country. So if the energy price environment remains benign in 25, that's a good thing. Low inflation, no pressure on the exchange rate, and all the rest that follows from that. And then I look at the international interest rate environment. The Fed has been cutting rates. That is anticipated to continue in 25, especially if the inflationary environment is not facing a shock. So that is also good for Pakistan, because the reach for yield that we saw, and you in particular famously wrote a lot about from 2014 onwards to 18, 19, 20 into the pandemic, that increases the availability of capital and the pool of capital available for Pakistan. So when I look at the global macro environment, I see a rather benign environment for Pakistan with a lot of tailwinds for the economy. How do you see 2025, again, looking at that global environment and then what's going on domestically in the country?
I think the big question mark in 2025 is the Middle East. Because you're right. I think otherwise the ice is melting, right? The U.S. Treasury rates are coming down, energy prices are coming off the recent peaks. In that sense, yes, there is and I think with the incoming Trump administration, perhaps an end to the war in Ukraine may be in sight. I think it's now possible to allow ourselves some measure of optimism on that as well. But the Middle East remains teetered on a very, very uncertain cliff. And that's one region from where a great deal of uncertainty can come cascading out. So, I'd be keeping my eyes on that. And I'd be keeping my eyes on the so-called tariff wars and how a Trump presidency may interact with China and to what extent, they're going to try and pursue the kind of campaign promises that Donald Trump made. So there are still drivers of uncertainty for the year 2025. But yeah, I do agree with you by the way, just to add here, I think at least in both the cases I've mentioned, the Middle East and with China and a Trump presidency, Pakistan would be sort of in a very tricky position. If the in the Middle East, if this does escalate into outright hostilities with Iran, for instance, that's a neighbor of Pakistan, and it's difficult to see how that instability is not going to find its way into Pakistan. And likewise with China, which is such a major investor in Pakistan with such massive stakes, and the United States, which is the country that organizes every bailout that Pakistan has ever had, and probably will be having again in the foreseeable future. Caught between these two, it's going to be a bit of a high wire act to perform. I'm not saying that it's impossible or any such thing, but I think the template shows both what you're pointing out, what you're pointing to, which is the melting away of the old environment, which was high energy, high capital costs, but significant drivers of instability still at play. So it'll be interesting to see how that shapes up for Pakistan in the forthcoming year.
Yeah, the Iran point is in particular very interesting, right? Because obviously there are expectations, in particular, the Saudi Arabia would have of Pakistan in such an event, because the security umbrella stretches all the way into Saudi and Jordan and Israel. So it's not that the Arab states are not covered by that security umbrella that would be tested in a confrontation with Iran. And then people often forget, especially in the West, and I often remind them that it was Pakistan and not Israel that was the first country to hit Iran with attacks, missile attacks, and retaliation to an Iranian attack on Pakistani soil since the Iraq-Iran war. So there is that angle to notice about the fact that there is a shared border, and that border can be hostile at times. And given everything that has happened in Syria and now internal issues in Iran, there is that question. Domestically, last question. You look at 25, what are you going to be watching out for in the overall economic environment in Pakistan and in the political economy writ large to sort of, maybe either double down on your recent columns, which are like, we've been here before and there's no evidence that this time is different, even though the government keeps saying last IMF program, to maybe saying, hey, something has changed and shifted, and perhaps 25 might actually lead to some real structural reform that makes you and I in particular change our perspective on the fact that Pakistan has been through stabilization numerous times before.
What will I keep my eye on? I'll keep my eye on the economy first of all, and see what they do after the adjustment, right? Because they can't stay in adjustment mode forever. So how do the politics of adjustment work out this time round? Number two, I will keep an eye out also on how the matter of the PTI and the opposition, the largest opposition, sort of resolves itself. This has probably been the hardest election to steal for the establishment. And they may think that they're in the clear now with the PTI sort of retreating into an internal squabbling among its various factions in the wake of the November 26th tragedy. But it's possible that they may be able to mount a comeback. I don't know, but I'll be keeping an eye on to see what happens with that, the confrontation between the establishment and the PTI in the year 2025. And Globally, I think all of us are going to be watching the Middle East very carefully, and all of us are going to be watching the opening days of a Trump presidency, and to discern the shape of things to come. Um, these would be some of the things to keep an eye on in the coming year.
Well, again, Khurram, thank you so much for your time. It was always a pleasure talking to you. Learn a lot and keep reading your columns all the time. So we'll keep an eye out on your written products at the end of the year as well. But in the meantime, thanks again for taking out the time, and hope to have you soon in 25 to see what is in store for the economy moving forward. Thank you.
Always a pleasure, Uzair.